Sometimes the smallest mark can carry the weight of an entire lifetime. The lunch crowd filled Harbor View Café with familiar conversations, clinking glasses, and the comforting smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee. It looked like any ordinary afternoon, the kind that passed without anyone expecting history to quietly walk through the front door. My name was Olivia Hayes, and at 26 years old I had spent nearly 5 years working as a waitress in the same waterfront restaurant outside Boston. I enjoyed the routine because it gave me stability, even if one question had followed me since childhood. I had been adopted before I was old enough to remember anything about my biological family. My adoptive parents loved me with all their hearts, but they never had many answers. They only knew I had been found after a terrible accident many years earlier. The only thing that remained from my earliest days was a pale crescent-shaped scar on my left wrist. Doctors believed it had been caused by a childhood burn, but nobody knew exactly how it happened. Over time I stopped asking questions because there was never anyone who could answer them. That afternoon another customer entered the cafe, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that looked elegant without being flashy. Several guests quietly recognized him before I did. Michael Bennett, the billionaire entrepreneur whose companies appeared in business magazines every month, greeted the hostess with genuine kindness and thanked the staff before taking a seat beside the window overlooking the harbor. He smiled politely as I approached with a menu and a glass of water. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary until I reached across the table to place the glass in front of him. My uniform sleeve slipped slightly above my wrist, exposing the old crescent-shaped scar for only a moment. Michael froze. The smile disappeared from his face as though someone had suddenly taken all the air from the room. His eyes remained fixed on the scar, and the color slowly drained from his expression. He stood so quickly that his chair slid backward across the wooden floor, causing nearby conversations to stop. I instinctively stepped back, wondering if I had accidentally spilled something or offended him without realizing it. Instead of speaking immediately, he stared at my wrist with tears beginning to gather in his eyes. Finally, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he asked a question that completely changed the direction of both our lives. "May I ask how you got that scar?" I looked down at my wrist before meeting his eyes again. "I wish I knew," I answered honestly. "I have had it for as long as I can remember." Michael slowly closed his eyes, as though he had just found something he had spent more than 20 years searching for, because the tiny crescent-shaped scar was identical to the one his little daughter had carried before she disappeared without a trace. Michael remained standing for several long moments before slowly sitting back down, never taking his eyes off the small crescent-shaped scar on my wrist. The entire cafe gradually returned to its normal rhythm, although I could still feel curious glances drifting toward our table. I offered an apologetic smile, assuming he had mistaken me for someone else. "Has something happened?" I asked gently. Michael drew a slow breath before answering. "Many years ago, my daughter suffered a small burn on her left wrist after reaching toward a camping lantern during a family trip. The scar healed into the exact same shape." His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of memories he had never escaped. I glanced down at my wrist again. "I wish I could tell you more," I admitted. "My adoptive parents said I was too young to remember anything before they brought me home." Michael looked surprised. "You were adopted?" I nodded. "They always told me the truth. They said I had been found after an emergency when several families were separated. The records were incomplete, and no one could identify my biological relatives." Michael lowered his eyes for a moment before quietly asking, "Do you know your exact birthday?" I answered without hesitation, and the date immediately changed his expression. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed an old leather wallet that looked as though it had traveled with him for decades. From a hidden compartment he unfolded a faded family photograph. A smiling little girl sat on his shoulders beside a lake while a young woman stood laughing beside them. Even though the picture had aged, the child's tiny left arm was clearly visible, and on her wrist rested the same pale crescent-shaped scar. My heart began beating faster. "She looks about 3 years old," I whispered. Michael nodded. She disappeared later that same year during the evacuation after a warehouse fire spread through part of our neighborhood. Hundreds of families were relocated in different directions. We searched for years, but every lead ended with another unanswered question. I carefully studied the little girl's face. Something about her smile felt strangely familiar, although I could not explain why. Before either of us could say another word, I remembered something my adoptive mother had given me shortly before she passed away. "There is an old keepsake box at my house," I said quietly. She told me never to throw it away because everything inside belonged to my life before I met her. I have never opened every envelope inside because she wanted me to wait until the right time. Maybe whatever you are searching for has been waiting there all along. Less than an hour later, Michael followed my car through quiet residential streets until we reached the small white house where I had grown up. My adoptive parents had both passed away several years earlier, but I had never found the courage to change anything inside the home they had filled with kindness. As I unlocked the front door, I felt an unexpected mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Every answer I had searched for might be hidden somewhere inside these familiar walls. I led Michael into the living room where family photographs covered the shelves, each one reminding me that love is not defined only by blood but also by the people who choose to raise and protect you. Near the fireplace stood an old oak cabinet. From its bottom drawer I carefully removed a small cedar keepsake box with brass corners that had always remained exactly where my adoptive mother left it. She once told me, "When life finally sends the right person to your door, you will know it before you understand it." At the time those words sounded mysterious. Now they felt almost prophetic. I placed the box on the coffee table and unlocked the tiny brass latch with a key I had worn on a chain for years without ever appreciating its importance. Inside rested several neatly organized envelopes, a faded baby blanket, a silver bracelet, an old hospital identification band, and a folded newspaper clipping preserved between two sheets of wax paper. Michael remained respectfully silent, allowing me to discover everything at my own pace. I picked up the hospital band first. Although the ink had faded, one detail remained perfectly readable. The admission date matched the birthday I had always celebrated. Michael leaned closer without touching it. His breathing became noticeably slower as hope and caution struggled against each other. Beneath the bracelet lay a small photograph showing a smiling toddler holding a stuffed rabbit beside a young couple whose faces had been partially damaged by time. Even so, the little girl's left wrist was visible, and the same crescent-shaped scar could be seen beneath the sleeve of her tiny sweater. I looked from the photograph to my own wrist, feeling as though the distance between my past and present had suddenly become very small. Finally I reached for the last unopened envelope. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were words that made both of us stop breathing for a moment. "To the family who finds our little girl, please keep this letter safe until the day someone comes looking for her." My hands trembled as I carefully opened the sealed envelope that had remained untouched for more than 2 decades. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. I slowly began reading aloud. "If you are holding this letter, then our daughter has been found by someone with a kind heart. We do not know who you are, but we thank you for protecting the little girl we love more than anything in this world." My voice almost disappeared as emotion tightened my throat. Michael quietly lowered his head, listening to every word with complete attention. The letter continued by explaining that during the chaotic evacuation after the warehouse fire, our family became separated when emergency responders directed frightened families toward different transportation routes. In the confusion, their young daughter had been temporarily placed with another group of children while both parents believed she had already been safely transferred elsewhere. By the time they realized the mistake, hundreds of families had already been relocated across several counties, and incomplete emergency records made tracing everyone nearly impossible. There was no anger anywhere in the letter, only gratitude toward anyone willing to care for a frightened child until the truth could one day be discovered. Near the bottom of the page, another sentence immediately caught Michael's attention. "Our daughter wears a small silver bracelet engraved with the initials OH, a gift from her grandmother before her 2nd birthday." Without speaking, I reached back into the keepsake box and lifted the delicate silver bracelet resting beside the hospital band. Years of polishing had nearly erased the engraving, but when Michael held it beneath the lamp, the tiny initials became visible once again. O.H. Olivia Hayes had always believed Hayes came from her adoptive family, yet my adoptive parents had never shared that last name. They had been the Martins. Michael looked at me with growing disbelief. Then Hayes was already part of your life before they found you, he whispered. I felt another wave of questions replacing the answers we had just uncovered. If the bracelet carried my original initials, who had chosen the name Olivia Hayes, and why had my adoptive parents never changed it? Beneath the letter rested one final folded document that had remained hidden between two pages. I unfolded it carefully and discovered a faded hospital transfer form bearing an official stamp. Most of the writing had become difficult to read, but one signature remained perfectly preserved. Michael stared at the name for several long seconds before quietly saying, I know exactly who signed this document, and if that person is still alive, they may finally explain everything that happened on the day we lost you. Early the next morning Michael arrived carrying a simple paper bag filled with breakfast from a neighborhood bakery instead of expensive gifts or legal documents. That small gesture surprised me more than anything else because it showed he cared about earning trust before asking for answers. We spread every item from the keepsake box across my dining room table once again, arranging the photographs, hospital band, silver bracelet, transfer form, and handwritten letter in careful order. Michael took notes quietly while I searched online archives for information about the hospital listed on the transfer document. After nearly an hour, we discovered that the hospital had merged with another medical center almost 20 years earlier, but many historical records had been preserved by the county archives. Michael suggested we visit in person instead of relying on incomplete digital files. During the drive neither of us spoke very much. We were no longer strangers connected by coincidence, yet neither of us wanted to rush toward a conclusion that still needed proof. At the county archives an elderly record specialist welcomed us with remarkable patience. After studying the transfer form, she explained that emergency evacuations during the warehouse fire had overwhelmed local hospitals, forcing staff members to create handwritten records under impossible conditions. Many children had been transferred multiple times within only a few hours. She disappeared into a secure storage room before returning with several large record books that had not been opened for years. Carefully turning each page, she eventually stopped and pointed to a handwritten entry matching the transfer number printed on my document. According to the record, a 3-year-old girl with a crescent-shaped burn scar on her left wrist had been temporarily placed under protective care while authorities searched unsuccessfully for her parents. The specialist looked at us with quiet sympathy. The nurse supervising this transfer personally wrote these notes, she explained. She insisted the child should keep her bracelet because she believed it would help reunite the family one day. Michael smiled faintly through grateful tears. Do you know what happened to that nurse? He asked. The specialist nodded. She retired many years ago, but she is still living in a small coastal town about 90 miles from here. Her memory is excellent, and she often speaks about the children she cared for during that difficult week. As we prepared to leave, the specialist handed me a photocopy of the original record. Attached to the final page was a handwritten note added several days after the evacuation. I read it silently before looking toward Michael in complete astonishment because the nurse had written one remarkable sentence. The little girl repeated her father's first name every night before falling asleep. The following afternoon Michael and I drove along the Massachusetts coastline until we reached a quiet seaside town where the retired nurse had lived for nearly 15 years. Her small white cottage overlooked the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by colorful flowers and weathered wooden fences that reflected decades of peaceful living. Margaret Collins welcomed us with a warm smile before we even introduced ourselves. When Michael showed her the photocopy of the emergency transfer record, she adjusted her glasses and studied the faded handwriting for several seconds. Then her eyes slowly filled with emotion. I remember this little girl, she whispered, looking directly at me. Some memories never leave you. She invited us inside, where shelves filled with family photographs and nursing awards surrounded a modest living room. Margaret carefully explained that the warehouse fire had created overwhelming confusion throughout the region. Emergency responders had rescued hundreds of people, including many frightened children who arrived without complete identification. Hospitals worked together under extraordinary pressure, transferring patients wherever space became available. No one intended to separate families, she said gently. Everyone believed they were making the safest decisions possible with the information they had. She remembered me because I refused to remove the tiny silver bracelet from my wrist and because I repeated the same name every evening before falling asleep. Margaret smiled kindly as she turned toward Michael. The name was Michael. You were the only word she repeated clearly. Tears filled his eyes as he quietly reached for my hand. Margaret continued by explaining that she personally wrote letters to every agency involved in the evacuation, hoping someone would match my bracelet and scar with a missing child report. Unfortunately, several records had been delayed when county offices transitioned to new filing systems, causing critical information to remain separated for years. Before we left, Margaret opened a small wooden desk and removed a carefully preserved notebook that she had kept from her nursing career. She turned to one page marked with a faded ribbon. There, beneath my transfer number, she had written a final observation. Child responds immediately to lullaby called Harbor Lights. Possible family tradition. Without thinking, Michael softly began humming the melody. The sound stopped me completely. My heart recognized the tune before my mind did. I had heard that lullaby throughout my childhood because my adoptive mother sang it every night before bed. She once told me it came from the little girl herself, who insisted on hearing it until she finally fell asleep. In that quiet room beside the ocean, we realized that even after losing everything else, one precious memory had traveled with me through every chapter of my life, silently waiting to guide me back to the family that had never stopped searching. As the sun began setting over the ocean, Michael and I sat quietly on a wooden bench outside Margaret's cottage, neither of us speaking for several minutes. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful, as though years of unanswered questions had finally begun settling into place. Margaret stepped outside carrying a small envelope she had forgotten to show us. I almost missed this, she said with an apologetic smile. It was filed separately because I intended to send it after the emergency, but I never learned where to mail it. She handed the envelope to Michael. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "To the father who never stopped looking." Michael slowly opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single page written by Margaret shortly after the evacuation. She had documented every identifying detail she could remember about the frightened little girl she cared for, including the crescent-shaped scar, the silver bracelet, the lullaby she repeated each night, and one sentence that immediately brought tears to both our eyes. Every morning she wakes up smiling because she believes her daddy will find her today. Michael covered his face for a moment as emotion overwhelmed him. When he finally looked up, he quietly whispered, "I tried every day." Margaret gently placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know you did. Everyone who worked beside me knew your family never gave up." During the drive back to Boston, Michael suggested something I had been expecting but was not yet ready to mention myself. "There is one final step," he said carefully. "Not because I doubt what we have discovered, but because I want every remaining question to disappear forever." I understood immediately. A DNA test would not create our relationship. It would simply confirm everything the letters, photographs, hospital records, bracelet, scar, and memories had already revealed. 2 days later we visited a respected medical laboratory where the staff treated us with kindness and professionalism. The collection process was brief, and we were told the results would be available within a week. As we walked outside, Michael smiled gently instead of appearing anxious. "Whatever those results say," he told me, "meeting you has already changed my life." I smiled back because I felt exactly the same. Yet later that evening, while organizing every document inside the keepsake box once more, I noticed a folded photograph hidden beneath the lining that neither of us had ever seen before, and the person standing beside my parents in that picture was someone who would make the final answer even more meaningful. The hidden photograph had been carefully tucked beneath the velvet lining of the keepsake box, protected so well that it had escaped every earlier search. I gently lifted it into the light while Michael stood beside me. The picture showed my parents smiling outside a small church on what appeared to be a family celebration. Standing next to them was my adoptive mother years before she became part of my life. We stared at the photograph in complete silence until I noticed something written across the back in faded blue ink. "Thank you, Anna, for promising to love our little girl if we cannot reach her in time." Michael slowly read the words aloud before lowering the photograph with trembling hands. "Anna," he whispered. "That was your adoptive mother." Suddenly everything became clear. My biological parents and my adoptive mother had not been strangers connected only by tragedy. They had known each other before the warehouse fire. Michael searched his memory and gradually remembered meeting Anna and her husband during several neighborhood charity events when everyone still lived in the same community. They were kind people who had struggled to have children of their own. After the evacuation separated countless families, Anna must have recognized me and protected me while believing my parents would soon be found. When months became years and every search ended without success, she honored the promise in the only way she could. She raised me with unconditional love while preserving every document that might someday return me to my original family. Tears filled my eyes, not from sadness but from overwhelming gratitude. I had never been abandoned. I had been loved by two families whose lives had been shaped by circumstances beyond anyone's control. A few days later the medical laboratory called to inform us that the DNA results were ready. Michael and I drove there together without speaking very much because neither of us felt nervous anymore. The evidence had already answered every important question. The laboratory specialist welcomed us into a private office and placed the sealed report on the desk. Michael looked toward me before gently sliding the envelope across the table. "Would you like to open it?" he asked softly. I nodded and carefully unfolded the official report. The conclusion was short, clear, and unmistakable. The probability of a biological father and daughter relationship exceeded 99.99%. Michael quietly closed his eyes as tears rolled down his face. I reached across the table and held his hand for the very first time. At that moment the report simply confirmed what our hearts had already accepted long before science placed its signature beneath the truth. Several months passed, and our lives slowly settled into a new rhythm built not on the years we had lost but on the moments we still had the chance to share. I continued working at Harbor View Café because it was more than a job. It was the place where an ordinary afternoon became the beginning of an extraordinary family reunion. Michael never asked me to leave the life I had built, and he never tried to replace missing years with expensive gifts or dramatic gestures. Instead, he visited the cafe every Saturday morning, sat at the same table beside the harbor, greeted every employee by name, and ordered the same breakfast with a grateful smile. The regular customers eventually stopped whispering about the famous businessman who came every weekend. To them he simply became the proud father waiting for his daughter to finish her shift. That simple truth meant more to both of us than any newspaper headline ever could. We also continued visiting Margaret whenever we traveled along the coast, bringing flowers and photographs from every family gathering. She always smiled when she saw us together because she believed the greatest reward of her nursing career had arrived many years later than expected. We never forgot my adoptive parents either. On a bright spring morning Michael and I stood together before their memorial, carrying white lilies and the small cedar keepsake box that had protected the truth for so many years. We thanked them for every sacrifice they had made, for every bedtime story, every school event, every encouraging word, and every act of unconditional love that shaped the person I had become. Michael quietly admitted that he had once believed another family had taken his daughter away, but now he understood something far more beautiful. They had simply loved a frightened little girl until her father finally found her again. Before leaving, I placed the silver bracelet beside the flowers for a moment, then fastened it back around my wrist where it had always belonged. Michael looked at me with gentle pride and softly asked, "May I finally call you my daughter without wondering if I have earned that right?" I smiled through grateful tears and answered, you never stopped being my father. We only needed time to find our way back to each other. We walked away side by side as the morning sunlight reflected across the harbor where our journey had first begun. Looking back, I realized that the scar on my wrist had never been a reminder of something I had lost. It had quietly become the bridge that guided me home. In the end, the greatest inheritance my two families gave me was not a fortune or a name. It was the lasting reminder that genuine love never stops searching, true kindness never asks for recognition, and a family built on hope can always find its way back together.